importance of finding a win-win-win solution where each side came away believing that its minimum requirements were addressed. And this was made possible first and foremost by the fact that Ukraine was in the end prepared to give up the nuclear weapons. And once that was clear, then that created a negotiating space. There was common ground where the United States and Russia could work on the actual conditions to make that happen. The second lesson was the importance of doing whatever worked and looking outside the box. So as Boris mentioned, I mean, the Ukrainian desire originally was for a treaty with legally binding security guarantees. And that was a bridge too far in Washington. But what Washington could do was bundle security assurances for Ukraine that, while not having legal meaning, had political meaning in a Ukraine-specific document that Washington believed was important for Ukraine in terms of giving Ukraine greater freedom of maneuver vis-a-vis Russia. A second example of doing what was worked came up in January, early January of 1994, at the negotiation here in Washington, where all the pieces were together except for two issues of difference. First of all, the Russian side wanted Ukraine to commit to a date certain when all the nuclear weapons were going to be out of Ukraine. And the Ukrainian side said that can happen by the middle of 1996, but for domestic reasons, we can't make that public now. The other issue was that the Ukrainians wanted compensation not only for the highly enriched uranium in the strategic warheads that were going to be transferred, but also some compensation for the highly enriched uranium that was in the tactical weapons that had already been withdrawn in 1992. The Russians said, we're prepared to do that, but we aren't going to make that public now because we don't want to get a demand from every other post-Soviet state for similar treatment. And so, from the American perspective, it would have been nice to have those things recorded in the Trilateral Statement, but the answer was, we don't need that public now. We can do it in exchange, and this was the exchange of letters among the three presidents that at the time was kept in a classified basis. The third area of doing what was worked was in November of 1994, when the Ukrainian Rada voted to accede to the Non-Proliferation Treaty in language that was at best ambiguous as to whether Ukraine was acceding as a non-nuclear weapon state. And this was very problematic for the Russians. The Russians said, we cannot accept this. And the solution, which took us, I think, until about 4 o'clock in the morning, the night before the final meeting in Budapest to work out, was an agreement where the Ukrainian government, when it handed over the instrument of accession, would do it under the cover of a diplomatic note in which the Ukrainian government said, this means we accede as a non-nuclear weapon state. So basically, the executive branch of Ukraine clarified the ambiguity in the Rada statement in a way that was acceptable to the Russians. A third lesson is the ability or the utility of presidential engagement. We had President Clinton going to be in Moscow on January 14th to meet with President Yeltsin. It was an easy trip to get President Kravchuk to come there in January 1994. So he defined a couple months before that, let's set that as a target. And once you had that sort of penciled in on all three presidents' agenda, it became much easier to make the American bureaucracy, the Russian bureaucracy, and the Ukrainian bureaucracy come together to do what was needed to meet that deadline. Likewise, at the end of 1994, when we noted we're going to likely to have all the presidents in Budapest for the CSCE summit, that's a good opportunity. Once that got fixed on calendars, that was, I think, the driver that led to a push by then President Kuchma to get the Rada to vote through the instrument of accession to the NPT that would allow Budapest to be the closing episode. Fourth lesson is never underestimate the value of money to grease the skids. The American ability to commit $175 million as a down payment on non-Luger assistance, I think, was important as a signal to Ukraine that there would be outside assistance to Ukraine to help Ukraine eliminate the missiles, the missile silos, the bombers, and all of the nuclear infrastructure it inherited. And that was a down payment on what was ultimately probably about an $800 million program in Ukraine. And then the fifth lesson is the importance of understanding the other side's needs. And this is one where I think probably both the United States and Russia could have done better vis-a-vis Ukraine. Boris has mentioned sort of the internal politics. I'm not sure that we were as smart as we could have been or that we reacted as we might have to the internal situation, that there were problems, there were issues that the president in Ukraine had to deal with in terms of elements of the Rada that wanted to hold on to these nuclear weapons. And we might have been a bit more thoughtful about that.